It was early October, one of those days where the woods seem quieter than usual, like the trees are holding their breath. I was out alone, taking advantage of a few days off work. I'd planned a 3-night solo hike in a stretch of forest near the state border, somewhere between civilization and real wilderness. Not backcountry, but quiet enough. The kind of place you might run into a hunter now and then, but not much else. I had an old printed map, not the best quality, but good enough for what I needed. The area had a couple of marked trails, loop routes mostly. I'd done one of them the day before and camped off the trail near a slow-moving creek. That night had been uneventful, just the regular rustlings of animals in the undergrowth and the soft pop of the campfire. The morning was overcast, cool. I broke camp after coffee and some instant oatmeal, loaded up my pack, and started walking. About 2 hours into the hike, I spotted a narrow trail off to the right. It wasn't on my map. It was faint, probably a game trail, but it looked like it had seen some human use, not recently, but enough to be noticeable. The main trail I was on had been winding through dense trees, offering little in terms of views. This side trail seemed to angle upward slightly, maybe towards a ridge. I figured it might lead to a better view or an old overlook. That kind of thing was common in areas like this, abandoned trails from decades back that didn't make it onto newer maps. I figured I'd go a half mile or so up and turn back if it led nowhere. I had time. The trail was narrow, hemmed in by saplings and brush. At some points, I had to duck under low-hanging branches. The ground was soft with leaf litter, the kind that muffles your footsteps. After about 15 minutes, the trail started to climb more steeply. I paused to catch my breath and noticed the first one. It was a doll, small, maybe 8 inches tall, handmade, roughly sewn from what looked like burlap. Its limbs were stiff, arms and legs stretched out like a scarecrow. Someone had nailed it to the trunk of a tree at chest height, just off the path. It wasn't hanging loose, it was pressed flat against the bark, nailed at the hands and feet. Its face was just 2 black button eyes and a stitched mouth. The whole thing looked like it had been outside for a while. The fabric was weather-stained, and the nails were rusted. I stared at it for a while, then looked around. The woods were still quiet. I couldn't even hear birds, just wind shifting through the high branches. I felt a little uneasy but told myself it was probably just something left by a local kid, or maybe part of some forgotten trail marker. I kept walking. Then I saw another, about 30 feet up the trail, nailed to another tree. Same kind of doll. This one had a red thread tied around its neck like a scarf. Still nailed in the same way, limbs stretched out. Its face was nearly the same too, though its button eyes were a little bigger. It was facing downhill, back the way I had come. So was the first one. I hadn't noticed that before. I kept going. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess. Or that strange kind of stubbornness that kicks in when you feel uncomfortable but not yet threatened. Like I had to see how far it went. I told myself I'd go just a little further. I saw a third doll not long after, then a fourth, all facing back down the trail, all nailed to trees at different heights, some lower, some almost at eye level. None of them looked brand new, but they didn't look ancient either. A few had bits of colored string or small trinkets attached. One had a little bell on a thread. Another had what looked like a bottle cap sewn onto its chest. They all shared that same blank stitched face. At that point, I stopped. My instincts were telling me to turn around. Something about the way they were all looking back, all placed like that, deliberate, pointed, felt wrong. Like I had walked into someone's warning sign, and I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned around. There was another doll. It hadn't been there before. It was nailed to a tree not 5 feet from me, right at eye level. Fresh with splinters curled around the edges of the nails, and the metal was still clean and shiny. The doll's burlap was dry, no signs of rain or mildew. Its eyes were uneven, one a button, the other a rough circle of black fabric. And its mouth wasn't stitched shut like the others. It was a wide black thread line, smiling. I froze. I looked back down the trail, scanning the trees, the underbrush. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But something had changed. The air felt heavier. My heart was pounding in my chest, fast and hard. I took one step back, then another. I walked fast, not quite running, but close. The trail seemed darker now, the trees thicker. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trail, but there was nothing. I passed the fourth doll, then the third. They looked the same, still facing downhill, still nailed there like little watchers. I didn't stop. I kept walking, almost jogging. My pack bounced on my back, and branches scratched at my arms. The silence was deeper now, no birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots and my own breath. I didn't see anyone, no movement, no sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, like someone had been there, just behind me, and had slipped away when I turned around. When I finally hit the main trail again, it felt like surfacing from underwater. The light seemed brighter, the forest less tight. I stopped and looked back at the entrance to that narrow trail. It didn't look like much. You could walk right past it and never notice. I stood there a minute, catching my breath, heart still hammering in my chest. Then I kept walking. I didn't stop until I was miles away. That night, I set up camp near a small lake, a wide open spot with a clear view in all directions. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I kept the rain fly off my tent, lying awake with my knife near my sleeping bag and a flashlight in my hand. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I finished the loop and got back to my truck by late afternoon. I didn't talk to anyone, didn't stop for food, just drove home in silence, thinking about those dolls. I've gone hiking since, plenty of times, but I stick to marked trails now. I pay attention to my maps. I don't take side paths that aren't marked. If something seems off, I turn around. I never reported what I saw. Who would I tell? What could I say? That someone out there is nailing dolls to trees like some kind of ritual? That one appeared behind me when I wasn't looking? All I know is this: whoever made those dolls meant something by it. They weren't decorations. They weren't there by accident. They were warnings, and I listened. I left the trailhead early that morning, carrying just what I needed for a few days alone in the woods. The sun was low, the air crisp and fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I liked to start early when I camped, the quiet, the light coming through the trees just right. It made me feel alive and safe, even when I was completely by myself. I had my small backpack with essentials, a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and my phone mostly for navigation and emergencies. The forest was dense. Thick trunks of spruce and fir stood like silent guards. I found a spot near a river that looked perfect for camping. A flat clearing just big enough for my tent, soft moss for my sleeping pad, and close enough to the water to fill my bottle. The river was clear and cold, rushing gently over smooth rocks, making a calming sound that mixed with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I set up my camp carefully. Stakes hammered in tight, tent doors zipped closed, and my pack put away under a tarp. I made a small fire ring with stones and gathered dry sticks, just enough to keep me warm that night. After the fire was crackling, I ate a little and crawled into my tent early, enjoying the warmth against the cold air outside. I wasn't scared, not really, but there was always that edge of something unknown when I was out here alone. I thought about how easy it would be to get lost if I wasn't careful, but I trusted my map and my compass, and my phone's GPS as backup. I checked the battery, 78%. Plenty for the next day. Morning came cold and gray, with mist hanging low over the river. I unzipped my tent, took a sip of water, and packed my things quickly. I decided to follow the river downstream. It was a good way to keep from getting lost, or so I thought. Rivers don't just end suddenly, they said. If I followed it, it would eventually lead me to a road or a town or some sign of people. I walked for a long time, the sound of the water constant in my ears. The trees grew thicker, the ground softer underfoot. I looked for a trail or a break in the trees, but everything looked the same. The same tall pines, the same moss-covered rocks, the same wet earth beneath my boots. After what felt like hours, I came to a narrow path that looked like it might lead back up a hill. I followed it, curious, hoping it would take me somewhere new. But it didn't. When the path opened up again, I was back at the clearing where my tent was pitched. I blinked, looked around, and walked carefully back to the tent itself. Nothing was disturbed. My gear was exactly where I left it. I even saw my fire ring, cold now with only a few ashes left from the night before. I pulled out my phone and looked at the screen. The time was 7:43 a.m. I checked the date. It was still the same day. Strange, because it felt like I had been hiking all morning. I shrugged it off. Maybe I had been walking in circles without realizing it. I decided to try again, this time sticking strictly to the riverbank. I followed the water downstream, scanning the forest for any sign of a trail, a road, or even a clearing. The river curved left, then right like it was teasing me. I climbed over fallen logs and stepped carefully over roots. My legs were tired, my boots wet from crossing shallow pools. The forest felt darker now, the mist thicker, wrapping around the trees like a cold, damp blanket. After a long walk, I found myself on a small ridge that gave me a better view. But what I saw made my stomach twist. Far below, the clearing with my tent was visible again. I squinted, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But there it was. My tent, the fire ring, the little patch of moss. It was impossible. I had come so far downstream. How could I be seeing my camp from here? I hurried down the ridge, my heart starting to pound with a strange mix of frustration and fear. When I reached the clearing again, I pulled out my phone. It still said 7:43 a.m. I stared at the screen, blinking hard. Maybe my phone was broken. Maybe it was frozen. I decided to try again. Maybe I was just tired or confused. Maybe the woods were playing tricks on me. I followed a different path along the river this time, the one that climbed higher into the trees. It was steeper, the ground slippery with wet leaves and pine needles. My hands brushed over rough bark and cold stones. The air was heavy with moisture, and I felt sweat running down my back despite the cold. After walking for what felt like hours, I tried to keep track, but my watch wasn't working either. I found myself at the edge of a small cliff. Below was the river again, winding and rushing, but on the other side of the water was the clearing. My camp, again. My mind raced. I sat on a rock, breathing hard. This couldn't be real. I was either lost in a loop or trapped in some weird natural maze. I thought about what I'd read about terrain like this. Rivers can sometimes split or circle back, but this was too perfect, too exact. That night, I slept poorly, waking often to the sound of the river and the hoot of an owl. My phone battery was down to 40%, but the time was still frozen at 7:43 a.m., the same time I had seen every time I woke. I tried charging it with my portable battery pack, but nothing changed. The next morning, I tried to keep calm. I told myself I would figure this out. I packed carefully and set off again, walking the riverbank, checking each path I found. But every trail led me right back to my camp. Every hill I climbed gave me the same view of the clearing, like a cruel joke. By the third day, I was running low on food and water. My boots were soaked through, my legs ached, and my hands were scratched from gripping rocks and branches. I had lost track of how many times I had woken up at the tent, with the phone stuck at 7:43 a.m. I started paying close attention to small things. The shape of the rocks in the river, the way the trees leaned. I tried to leave marks. I scratched an X on a tree with my knife. I stacked small piles of stones. But the next time I circled back, the marks were gone. Either the wind or rain had erased them, or maybe I had wandered so far that I was no longer in the same place I thought. I wasn't sure anymore. At some point, I realized I had stopped trying to fight it. I stopped worrying about going downstream or upstream or trying different paths. I just walked, following the river and hoping for the best. I didn't think about the phone's frozen time anymore. I didn't think about the tent being the same in every direction. By the fourth day, my food was gone. I drank from the river carefully, trying to avoid sickness. My feet were blistered. I was exhausted and scared, but also strangely calm, like I was accepting something I couldn't change. It was early afternoon when I heard the hum of a motor. I looked up the river and saw a small boat with two men in it. They were wearing life jackets and carrying fishing gear. I waved my arms, shouting, hoping they would see me. They did. They pulled the boat over to shore, and one of them helped me climb in. They gave me water and a blanket and called for help on their radio. I told them about the loop, the frozen time on my phone, and the strange way the paths led me back to camp. They nodded and told me it wasn't the first time someone had gotten stuck in that part of the forest. The river's bends and hidden backwaters made it easy to lose your sense of direction. The mist and thick trees created illusions. They called it a natural maze, caused by the way the river curved and the way the forest grew around it. My phone's time, they said, was probably a glitch caused by poor signal and cold weather affecting the battery. The lost marks and repeated paths were just part of the confusing landscape. With no clear landmarks, it's easy to feel like you're going in circles. They said people sometimes get trapped in that part for days, disoriented, exhausted, and scared. But eventually, they find their way out or get lucky like I did. As we floated downriver toward a ranger station, I looked back at the forest. The trees seemed less threatening now. The river was still rushing, still twisting. But I knew I wouldn't be coming back to that spot anytime soon. I'd learned something important. Nature doesn't have to be supernatural to be terrifying. Sometimes the woods and the water themselves are enough to make you feel lost in time and space, to trap you in a loop that's all too real. And when that happens, the best hope is that someone notices you before you run out of time. The third night was the worst. I woke up standing, barefoot, at the edge of a steep drop I didn't recognize. My arms were hanging loose by my sides, and I was breathing hard like I'd been running. The moon was high enough that I could see the glint of rocks below, maybe 200 feet down. For a moment, I just stood there, confused, before my body snapped into panic. I stumbled backwards, fell, caught myself on hands and knees, heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. When I calmed down enough to think, I looked around. The trees were different. I wasn't anywhere near my tent. I didn't even know how I'd gotten out of it. I didn't sleepwalk. At least I never had before. But I sure as hell hadn't consciously walked a couple hundred feet barefoot through rocky undergrowth, in my sleep, in the cold, up a slight slope, and not woken up once. I stood and turned in a slow circle. My camp wasn't visible, but based on the slope, I figured it was downhill. I wasn't sure which direction, but I could guess. I looked at the dirt. Nothing. No prints. The ground was dry but soft enough to catch tracks. I found one, eventually, heading away from a space of flattened grass. My own heel print, but only one set of tracks, leading from my tent, not to it. I walked back barefoot, trying not to think too hard about it. The idea that I might be losing my mind felt real and close, or that something else was happening that I didn't understand. I made it back just as the sun started to rise. The tent was unzipped halfway, like I'd left it. My boots were right inside the flap. The fire had burned out to cold ashes. The first night I'd felt uneasy. Nothing obvious, just a low hum of nerves. The trees felt too tall, too still. But I chalked it up to camping solo again for the first time in a year. The second night, I woke up with pine needles stuck to my face and arms. My sleeping bag was half unzipped and cold. I figured I'd had to pee and just forgotten. Maybe walked out to the trees and come back without thinking. But the third night, standing above a drop with no memory of getting there, that was different. That scared me in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. That day, I stayed near camp. I checked my supplies, drank coffee, stared at the map even though I knew where I was. I considered hiking out, but I had 3 days left on my loop and didn't want to cut it short. I wasn't that far from a trailhead, but it meant turning back, and I hate turning back. I told myself I was being dramatic. Sleepwalking happens. Stress, maybe a weird dream. I tied a rope to my ankle that night, ran the other end through a loop I made in one of the tent's internal anchor points. If I moved too far, I'd know. Simple. Morning came. I woke up in the tent just past sunrise, but the rope was loose, still tied to the tent, still around my ankle, but untied and loosely looped, like someone had carefully unknotted it and then loosely tossed it over me. My sleeping bag was unzipped, again. I checked my arms, bits of bark, dirt under my nails. I got up and looked for tracks, same as before. One set of prints heading away, This time I followed them farther. They led down to a small creek, past it, then up again to a flat shelf overlooking the valley. I found a flat rock with scuffed marks around it. Pine needles pushed to the side, like someone had stood there a while, maybe paced. No prints around it, just a few odd scratches I couldn't place. I sat down on the rock and tried to remember anything. Nothing came. I was either walking in my sleep or something was happening that didn't make sense. That night, I tied the rope again. This time, I used a climbing knot, a figure-8 follow-through. I used 2 carabiners to clip the rope to the anchor inside the tent, then looped the free end around my ankle twice and clipped that too. It wasn't coming loose without effort. I even tested it. Got up, tugged hard, tried slipping out. Nothing. When I woke up, it was still dark. I was outside again, standing. My bare feet were cold and damp. I was 20 feet from camp, near the tree line. I could see the tent, dark against the pale outline of the clearing. The rope lay limp on the ground behind me. Both knots were untied. Not cut, not frayed, just untied. Carabiners still locked. My stomach dropped. My pulse felt like it jumped sideways in my chest. I didn't move for a long time, just stared at the rope, then back at the tent, trying to wrap my head around it. I walked back, climbed into the tent, and zipped it up. I sat there until the sun rose, wide awake. That day, I didn't leave camp at all. I kept a fire going, drank coffee, stayed near the bear bag I'd hung the night before. The sound of the woods felt too quiet. The wind moved in little gusts that didn't match the stillness of the trees. I listened for anything unusual. Nothing. I tried to nap. I was exhausted, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined myself waking up standing at the edge of another cliff. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt watchful. That night, I went a step further. I tied the rope again, using multiple knots. I wore my boots to sleep. I zipped the sleeping bag halfway and left the headlamp on my chest. I tucked a knife into the flap by my feet. I left a thermos of coffee by my side. I even tried to stay awake. I managed until maybe 3 a.m. I woke up cold, headlamp off. The tent flap was open. The rope was off again. No marks on the tent. My boots were still on, but damp. I crawled outside and looked around. Just before dawn, a light mist hung low over the ground. I stood and walked to the nearest patch of dirt. One set of footprints, mine, leading away again. But this time, there were faint smudges on the sides. Drag marks, like I'd been pulling the rope behind me. I followed them for about 200 yards, up a slope into thick brush. I found a spot with broken branches at about chest height, and something else, a tree with bark stripped off in patches. Not scratch marks, rubbed clean like someone had leaned against it again and again. The smell hit me before I saw anything else. Sweat, old sweat like unwashed clothes, and something like rot. I stepped back. My skin crawled. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around and went back to camp. I packed everything as fast as I could. Fire still cold, stove still warm from the last pot of coffee. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just packed, double-checked my map, and hiked out. I walked until my feet ached, then kept walking. Didn't stop for lunch, didn't stop to rest. Made it to the trailhead by late afternoon. My truck was untouched. I threw everything into the back and got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. When I got home, I checked my gear. The rope wasn't cut. It was unknotted like someone who knew what they were doing had taken their time. The carabiners were still locked. My boots had burrs stuck in the laces. On my sleeping bag, a faint smear of something dark near the zipper. I washed everything twice. A few weeks later, I looked up reports from that area. No big warnings, no attacks, no missing persons right then. But I found one thing. 2 years earlier, a hiker went missing about 5 miles from where I camped. Solo hiker. Tent found undisturbed. No signs of struggle. They said maybe a fall, maybe an animal. No one knew. I don't know what happened out there. I didn't see anyone. But I know I didn't untie that rope myself. I know I didn't choose to stand at the edge of that drop. And I know I didn't sleep that last night. Whatever or whoever was out there, they were quiet, careful, and they knew how to move without leaving tracks. Or maybe just how to cover them. I don't camp solo anymore. Not deep in the woods. Not without cell service. I don't care how remote or beautiful a spot is. If it's too quiet, I go somewhere else. Because sometimes you're not the only thing in the woods. And sometimes you wake up just in time. I had been out camping alone dozens of times before, but this trip felt different from the start. I had driven 4 hours to reach a stretch of old-growth forest tucked away in a state park that wasn't on many people's radar. No cell service, no marked trails past a certain point. Just dense woods, moss-covered logs, and trees that looked like they had stood since the last ice age. I went because I wanted silence, peace, a break from everything. I got that for the first day and a half. My camp was simple, just a small one-man tent tucked between 2 massive cedar trunks, a fire ring made from river rocks, and a fallen log I used for sitting and eating. I had brought a small cooler with some food, water filter gear, and my old camping knife. I even had a book I was trying to finish, something I hadn't made time for in months. The first night was uneventful. The wind was gentle, the fire crackled, and the stars peeked through breaks in the canopy. I slept well. It was sometime during the second afternoon that I first noticed the sound. It wasn't loud or sudden. It came like a breeze, quiet and tucked into the rustle of leaves, as if it had always been there and I was just now hearing it. I was sitting on the log, boiling some water for coffee, when I heard a whisper. Not a voice exactly, more like the suggestion of one, just enough to make me pause. I turned and looked into the trees, thinking maybe someone had wandered close to my camp without me noticing. But there was nothing, just the same forest, the same long trunks and thick undergrowth. A few birds, the wind shifting through the upper branches. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks, or the wind bouncing off the trees in a strange way. But the thing was, I heard it again an hour later. And again after that, each time the wind picked up and moved through the same spot in the forest. Always near the same tree. That tree stood maybe 30 yards from my camp. I hadn't paid it any special attention until then. It was taller than the others around it and had a wide, gnarled base with roots like stretched out fingers crawling across the dirt. The bark was darker, thick and rough, and I noticed something odd about the way it leaned. Not a natural curve, but more like it had once started to fall and then changed its mind. Each time the wind moved through its upper limbs, I could hear that same faint whispering, like breath passing over dry lips in a far-off room. I kept trying to brush it off. I told myself it was probably just a bird nest high up in the branches or the way the leaves were shaped. I didn't feel scared exactly, just uneasy. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my tent, listening, waiting. The wind was steady, not strong, but steady, and each time it stirred, I heard it. A hush. Not quite words, but close enough to stir something deep in me. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got up early and made my coffee, then decided to check out the tree up close. I walked over slowly, watching the way the wind moved through it. No other tree in the area made the same sound. The ones on either side rustled like normal, a soft brushing sound. But this one whispered. Up close, it looked even stranger. There were thick knots all up and down its bark, but one in particular near the base caught my eye. It wasn't just a knot. It looked like a face. Not in the way people say clouds or would grains look like faces. This one really did. A twisted, sunken face with what looked like eyes and a mouth. The bark contorted like it had grown around something painful. It wasn't symmetrical, and it didn't look carved. It looked like it had just grown that way over time. The kind of thing you'd walk past without noticing unless you were looking close, or listening. Then I saw the knife. It was buried in the bark about 4 feet up the trunk, right where one of the lower limbs jutted out. The blade was long and rusted, and the handle, what was left of it, was old wood, weathered and cracked. The tree had grown around it, swallowing the lower half of the blade and part of the handle. It must have been there for decades. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to imagine who had put it there and why. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, listening, thinking. I started to feel watched. Every time the wind picked up, I could hear it again, but now I was sure it wasn't just wind. It was speech, low and broken. Not English, not any language I knew. Just something close enough to scratch at the edges of understanding. I started thinking about the knife again and the face in the bark. The more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. Like that tree had been holding something back, and I had brought attention to it just by looking. Around midnight, I heard something move, not far from the tent. A crack of twigs, a crunch of dry ground. I froze. I didn't breathe. I just lay there listening. It didn't sound like an animal. It wasn't steady enough. It was like someone shifting their weight back and forth. Then nothing. Just the wind again. The whisper again. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out slow and quiet. My breath showed in the beam of the light. It was colder than it had been all week. I swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. No movement, no eyes reflecting back. But I didn't feel alone. That tree 30 yards off looked like it was watching me. And for the first time, I noticed something else. The dirt around it looked disturbed. Not fresh exactly, but not untouched either. A few stones kicked loose, the faint outline of what might have been a footprint, long since faded. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting with my back to my pack, my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. The whispers didn't stop. They came with every breeze. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up fast, barely ate. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time. I wasn't afraid of ghosts or monsters or anything like that. I don't believe in that stuff. But something had happened near that tree. Something that left a mark deep enough for the forest to remember. Maybe someone had been hurt out there. Maybe that knife was left as a marker. Or maybe it had been buried in anger or guilt. Trees don't forget. I believe that now. Before I left, I walked back to the tree one last time. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a tree. Just wind and age and coincidence. But when I stood in front of it, I felt that same whisper move through me, like breath down my neck. I stepped closer and saw something I hadn't noticed before. There were initials carved near the knife. Faded and shallow, almost erased by time, but still there. JW 1968, or maybe 1969. I looked around again, and suddenly the forest didn't feel as empty. It felt like something had been left behind. Not a ghost, not a curse. Just weight, memory, the kind that settles in and never leaves. I didn't take the knife. I didn't touch the tree. I just turned and walked out. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck. I looked back once before I drove away. The forest looked the same, peaceful, quiet, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back. Sometimes at night, if the wind's right and my windows are open, I still think I hear it. That same hush, like dry breath in the leaves. I tell myself it's nothing, just air, just memory. But I sleep with the windows shut now, and I don't camp alone anymore. I set up camp in a wide, grassy meadow that sat between two ridgelines, maybe 8 miles from the trailhead. It was late September. Leaves were starting to change, but the days were still warm. Nights had a bite to them, though, the kind that makes your breath hang in the air. I liked camping alone. Always had. Something about the quiet and the feeling of being far from anything man-made calmed me. That meadow felt like the perfect spot. Flat ground, a small creek off to the west, a few windbreaks made of young pine, and no sign of anyone else. I reached it around late afternoon after a solid 6-hour hike. I'd passed a couple on their way down in the early miles, but saw no one past the 3-mile mark. By the time I got my tent up, cooked a quick dinner on my little stove, and hung my bear bag, the sky was already turning gold and pink. I sat on a log near the creek, watching the light fade, feeling that mix of calm and smallness that only comes when you're deep in the woods. I didn't have cell signal, which I expected. I had a GPS and a paper map in case I got turned around. I wasn't worried. I'd done this kind of solo trip at least a dozen times. The first time I saw the figure was just before dark. I had stood up to stretch and take a leak before turning in, and as I turned toward the tree line to the east, the same direction I'd come from, I noticed something. At first I thought it was a stump or a shadow from a tree, maybe 30 or 40 yards in. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person, just standing there, not moving, no flashlight, no visible gear, nothing. I stared for a good minute trying to make sense of it, but they didn't move, they didn't wave, they didn't make any sound, just stood there. I considered yelling something, but something about the way they stood so still made me keep quiet. Eventually, I backed up slowly toward my tent and zipped myself in. I sat there for a long time listening. No footsteps, no twigs snapping, nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I'd start to drift off, I'd wake up thinking I heard something outside. The wind picked up around 1 a.m. and I told myself that's all it was, just the wind. But still, I kept the bear spray near my sleeping bag and didn't fully fall asleep until the sky started to lighten. The next morning, I got up, stepped outside, and walked toward the spot where I'd seen the person. Nothing. No footprints I could find, though the grass was pretty thick in some areas, and the forest floor was mostly pine needles. I didn't go too far in. I didn't want to lose the camp's position or get turned around. The trees were dense in that direction, but the spot looked empty, clean. I almost packed up right then. Thought about it seriously. But the weather was good. I had 2 more days, and I tried convincing myself it could have been a hunter or another camper messing around. People do dumb things sometimes. I convinced myself of that long enough to stay. That day was quiet. I did a few small hikes with just my pack and GPS, took pictures, sat and journaled. Normal stuff, but I was on edge. Kept turning around when I didn't need to, kept listening too hard. By the time dusk came, I talked myself into staying again, but I wasn't as relaxed as the day before. I sat facing the tree line this time, wrapped in my jacket and holding my flashlight, and then I saw them again. Same spot, maybe 10 yards to the left. Same posture, standing, still, no light, no sound. I held my flashlight in my lap, unsure whether to turn it on. I didn't want to show them exactly where I was, but I also didn't want to be sitting there in the dark, staring at something I couldn't fully see. I turned the light on and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing there. But when I turned it off, let my eyes adjust, they were back, just standing there. It didn't make sense. I aimed the light again. Still nothing. That trick of the beam not reaching all the way, maybe, but it shook me. I went into my tent, zipped it shut, and listened again. Nothing. No movement. No twigs. I kept my knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other. Didn't sleep again that night. At some point near dawn, I convinced myself it must be a tree. Maybe 2 thin trunks side by side, shaped just right to look like a person. Or some trick of light and shadow. I got up again with the sunrise and walked toward the spot. Nothing. No tree. No trunk. Just a slight clearing, then thick brush and more forest. That's when I started to get nervous for real. Not scared like before, but nervous in that crawling, gut-deep way. Like you're about to get sick. I decided I'd stay 1 more night and hike out in the morning. I don't know why. I think part of me didn't want to leave with that fear. I wanted to prove to myself it was just my head messing with me. The day went by slow. I barely left the tent. Read for a while. Wrote a bit. Cooked dinner earlier than usual just to have something to do. I didn't build a fire. Felt wrong to call more attention to myself. As night came, I stayed in the tent, sitting up, listening again. I kept the fly open halfway so I could see out the mesh screen toward the trees. The moon was bright. I didn't need a light. That's when I saw them again. Closer this time, maybe 20 yards from the edge of the meadow. Still not moving. Still just standing there. No flashlight. No gear. No sound. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I watched for what felt like hours. I wanted to scream. Wanted to ask what they wanted. But I didn't. I stayed frozen. Eventually, I must have nodded off. My body couldn't stay that tense forever. When I woke, it was morning. Bright, birds chirping, Everything looked normal, but I packed my camp as fast as I ever have. Didn't eat, didn't filter water, just got my things and started hiking out. I didn't stop until I was nearly back to the parking area. The whole way I kept checking behind me, but saw nothing. No one followed. The whole trail felt empty. At the trailhead, there was a ranger truck parked near the lot. The ranger was standing outside, talking with a couple who looked like they had just come off the trail too. I didn't plan to say anything, just wanted to get in my truck and go. But as I passed, the ranger nodded and asked how the trip went. I paused. Then I told him, just the basics. Camped in the big meadow. Saw someone standing at the tree line every night. Didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. He didn't laugh, didn't act surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "That's the third report this month." I stopped, looked at him. "All solo campers," he said. "All in that same meadow. Always alone. Always quiet. We've sent people out. Haven't found anything yet." I asked if it was someone messing with people. Maybe playing some sick prank. He shrugged. Could be. Could be someone watching. Could be something else. But no one's been hurt, and we haven't caught anyone. We're keeping an eye on it. I nodded and got in my truck. Driving home, I kept going over it. I told myself it was all in my head, or some strange tree. But that last night, they were closer, clearer. I know what I saw. I know it wasn't nothing. Back home, I looked up news reports. Couldn't find anything specific. Just a few scattered forum posts, people talking about strange things in that park, in that region. Nothing solid. But it stuck with me. I still camp. Still go alone sometimes. But I haven't gone back to that meadow. I don't plan to. And I check the tree line a little more often now. I always liked the quiet. That's why I started camping solo a few years ago. There's something about being completely on your own that resets everything. No phones buzzing, no emails, no background noise except wind, trees, birds, and whatever small animals decide to come poking around. I always feel more like myself out there. I planned this trip for months. There was an old mining site about 2 hours outside a small town in Colorado, tucked into the base of a ridge near the edge of a pine forest. The site hadn't been active in over 100 years. You could barely find any info on it online, just a couple mentions in historical forums and a scanned newspaper article from the 1880s. That's what caught my interest. The land was technically public, and as far as I could tell, nobody really went out that way anymore. I left town in my old Tacoma just before noon. The weather was clear, high 60s, sun overhead. The last 20 miles of the drive were on a gravel road that twisted through thick forest. The GPS stopped working around mile 15, but I'd printed out topographic maps and had a compass just in case. After bouncing along for what felt like forever, I spotted a rusted sign nailed to a leaning post, Stoker Hollow, mining site ST 1873. That was my marker. I parked the truck at a wide flat spot just off the road and hiked about a half mile in. There wasn't a trail, just soft forest floor and thick underbrush. I found a clearing on the edge of an old collapsed structure, probably one of the bunkhouses. The stones were covered in moss, and the wood had long since rotted away. A good place to set up camp. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, and made a small circle of stones for the fire pit. The sun was starting to drop by the time I cooked dinner, just a can of chili and some cornbread I brought in foil. I sat on a log eating while the last orange light bled through the trees. No sounds but the occasional rustle and the pop of the fire. I'd forgotten how good it felt to be out there, off-grid. I had a shortwave radio and a basic walkie-talkie set with me. I don't know why, maybe out of habit. Sometimes I just liked tuning through the static. At night, you'd catch bits and pieces. Truckers, weather reports, sometimes weird chatter from who knows where. I pulled the walkie from my pack and clicked it on. It was an old set I'd had for years. One of those brands from Walmart, black with a little crack screen. I flipped through frequencies, one after another. Static, more static, then a garbled voice that faded in and out. Caught my ear. I held the walkie closer. Reckon he's to be buried for sun's down. The voice was thin and crackly, but clear. Male, maybe middle-aged. I adjusted the dial and listened closer. Another voice replied, this one deeper, slower. Ayu, poor bastard ain't got much left to bury. Their accents were thick, old, rural, maybe Appalachian or Southern, but something about the words, the way they talked, it didn't sound modern. No slang I recognized. Their tone was casual, like they were sitting around a table or leaning on shovels. I sat still, eyes on the fire, barely breathing. A third voice chimed in higher, almost sing-song. Shoulda never took that job in the shaft. Whole thing's gone sour. Then laughter. Not loud, just a few chuckles like they were sharing an inside joke. I turned the volume down slightly, holding the walkie in my lap. At first, I figured it was a reenactment or some kind of radio theater, maybe a podcast broadcast I'd stumbled onto. But I kept listening, and the conversation flowed naturally. They weren't reading from a script. You see her? One of the voices asked. Out by the East Ridge, walking like she's lost, pale as linen. You think she's real? Pause. Don't know, but she weren't here yesterday. I froze. I looked out past the fire into the trees. The East Ridge was the slope I'd hiked down from earlier. No one else was out here. I was sure of it. I hadn't seen another car, heard another person. Nothing. I checked the time. 10:46 p.m. I kept the walkie close, my hand tightening around it. The men kept talking. I couldn't always catch everything. They spoke over each other at times, and static cut in now and then. But the conversation felt real. They spoke about dynamite problems, a horse going lame, a man getting crushed under timbers. One mentioned a letter he couldn't send because the damn wire's out again. At some point, I realized they weren't just talking about mining. They were talking about life here, Stoker Hollow. One of them mentioned the name directly. It made my stomach tighten. These weren't stories. These were updates, daily news, shared memories. Wind's picking up. Ain't natural tonight. She's listening now. That line came out of nowhere. A man's voice. Flat, direct, no accent. She's listening now. Then silence. I stared at the walkie, still clutched in my hand. My thumb hovered over the off button. No static, no follow-up, no click or fade out. Just nothing. I turned it off. Suddenly the fire seemed too loud. The woods too quiet. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going too long, burning through more wood than I'd planned. Every snap of a twig outside the tent made me sit up, heart racing, knife in hand. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind. The next morning, I walked the perimeter around camp, just to settle my nerves. No signs of anyone. I scanned the slope back up to the road, checked behind the ruins of the old building, even circled a shallow pit I guessed used to be a collapsed shaft entrance. Nothing. No footprints. No trash. No tire tracks at the old signpost. I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone was screwing around with an old CB radio. Maybe a couple guys decided to stage a weird roleplay session out here, and I just happened to catch it. But I couldn't stop thinking about that last voice. That one sentence. She's listening now. I decided to stay one more night. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't scared. Or maybe I wanted to hear more, get some kind of explanation. I don't know. That afternoon I didn't hike or explore. I stayed close to camp, sharpened my knife, organized gear. I cleaned the old fire pit and rechecked my food stash. I left the walkie off. When the sun went down, I started a fire again, but this time kept it smaller. I didn't eat much, just some trail mix and a piece of jerky. I kept looking at the walkie-talkie, sitting on the log next to me. Around 9:30, I clicked it on again. Static. More static. Then a voice. Only one this time. Soft, low. She's back. I stood up. No more talking now. Click. Silence again. The kind of silence that doesn't even have wind in it. That was it. That was all I needed. I didn't sleep. I packed everything up in the dark. Tent, stove, food, gear. I used a headlamp and kept the knife out in my pocket. Every rustle made my breath catch in my throat. I got it all back to the truck by midnight, hiked fast and silent, and drove without stopping until I hit pavement. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Who would believe me? There was no ghost, no shadowy figure, no strange lights. Nothing touched my tent or dragged footprints in the dirt. But I've been camping solo for years. I know what silence feels like. I know the difference between a bird call and a person's voice. And I know what it sounds like when someone knows you're there, even if you can't see them. I tried going back once, months later, just a day trip. But when I got near that old turnoff sign, I kept driving. I told myself I was just tired, but really, I didn't want to know what I'd hear if I turned the walkie on again. I still have it. It sits in a drawer in my gear closet, battery out. I haven't touched it since. There are things out there you can't explain. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people. People who were here long before us. And maybe they didn't all leave. Maybe some voices stick around in ways we don't understand yet. All I know is I was there and I heard them, and they knew I was listening. The desert was endless, a vast sea of sand and rocks stretching in every direction, baking under the brutal sun during the day and freezing cold at night. I had been walking for hours, my boots kicking up dust, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. My water was running low, but I was determined to make camp before nightfall. I found a spot near a cluster of jagged rocks that broke the horizon, a little shelter from the wind. The desert was quiet except for the occasional rustle of dry brush in the breeze. While scouting around the rocky outcrop before setting up my tent, I noticed something odd. Between two large boulders, there was a narrow crack, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was like a thin line cutting down into the earth. What caught my attention was the rusty ladder bolted inside the crevice. The metal was corroded, orange-brown with rust, and the rungs looked old and unstable. It seemed out of place here, in this harsh, empty landscape. Why would someone leave an old ladder there, leading who knows where? Curiosity pulled me closer. I peered down the crevice, but the darkness swallowed the bottom. I couldn't see how deep it went. I didn't have a flashlight on me, just my phone, which was already drained from trying to get a signal earlier. Still, the idea of climbing down there crossed my mind, but something held me back. The ladder didn't look safe, and the crack was narrow enough that I might get stuck. Besides, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. It was better to be cautious. Night began to fall, and the temperature dropped sharply. The desert night was a different kind of wild, silent, but tense. I set up my small tent near the rocks and started a campfire with some dry twigs and brush. The flames flickered against the darkness, casting long shadows over the crevice. I sat there eating some trail mix, trying to shake off the strange feeling the ladder had given me. It was stupid, really. Probably just an old mining or water well shaft from decades ago. Then, just as I was getting ready to crawl into my sleeping bag, I heard it, a faint sound drifting out from the crevice. It was soft, almost like crying. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears. The crying was there again, quiet but distinct, like a small child sobbing. It didn't last long, just a few seconds before fading into the desert wind, but it was enough to make me sit up straight. I told myself it was probably an animal caught somewhere, or maybe the wind playing tricks, but the sound was definitely human. The thought of a child crying deep in the desert made no sense. I scanned the dark opening with my eyes but saw nothing. The night was too black. I checked my phone again for a flashlight, but the battery was dead. Still feeling uneasy, I grabbed a glow stick from my pack, a cheap, small tube that gave off a weak green light for hours. I cracked it open and dropped it down the ladder shaft. The glow stick's faint light disappeared into the darkness below, but it never hit bottom. I waited, counting silently, expecting to hear a faint tap or see a soft glow return, but nothing. No sound, no light, just the dark swallowing the glow stick. I sat back, the firelight flickering on my face, and felt a chill despite the desert heat. The crying started again. Shorter this time, almost like a whisper, but enough to send shivers down my spine. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to the quiet and the occasional sob from the crevice. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I packed up quickly and decided to check the crevice in daylight. Maybe I could see something with the sun high above. I pulled out my climbing rope and tied it around a sturdy rock near the edge. With some hesitation, I started lowering myself down the rusty ladder. The metal groaned under my weight, and the ladder swayed slightly. The crack was tight, scraping my shoulders and backpack. I kept climbing carefully, rung by rung, until my feet hit solid ground below. A narrow tunnel carved by wind and water over countless years. The air down there was cooler, damp, and smelled like earth mixed with rust and dust. I shone my phone's flashlight ahead, revealing walls of cracked stone and sand piles on the floor. The tunnel twisted and narrowed further down. I could hear a faint drip of water somewhere far away. I followed the tunnel slowly, every step stirring dust that hung in the air like fog. Then I saw it. Faint marks on the walls like scratches. Not animal claws, but something made by a tool or maybe nails. They were low to the ground, as if made by a child crawling or dragging their fingers along. The tunnel led to a small, wider chamber. I shone my light around and saw a few scattered objects. A broken toy car, a torn piece of cloth, maybe from a shirt, and an old, cracked plastic cup. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here maybe a long time ago or maybe recently. I kept going deeper, but the tunnel grew tighter. My shoulders scraped the walls, and I could feel the sand shifting under my boots. Then the tunnel dropped sharply downwards into a hole so dark my light couldn't reach the bottom. I dropped a second glow stick down the hole. Just like the first, it vanished into the darkness, never hitting the bottom. I listened closely, and then, faintly again, I heard it, the sound of crying. Quiet, broken sobs, like a child lost and scared. I climbed back up carefully, feeling the weight of something I couldn't explain. The crevice was a hidden place, maybe an old mining shaft or a forgotten well. But why the crying? It made no sense. There was no way a child could be down there, trapped in the middle of nowhere, and no signs of rescue or disturbance around the opening. Back at camp, I sat by the fire, my mind racing. The crying didn't come from any spirit or ghost. It was more likely the sound of wind, maybe air trapped inside the tunnel, moving in a way that made it sound like sobbing. The shape of the crevice might be creating strange echoes or noises. I realized the ladder was old and unsafe. Someone must have tried to explore the shaft years ago, leaving the ladder behind. The toys and the cloth were probably left from past visitors, or maybe remnants of a small animal's nest. The glow stick never hitting bottom told me the hole was deep, too deep for any human to be down there without equipment. The crying sound was probably the wind moving in and out of the tunnel's shape, creating a sad, broken noise. I decided not to go back down. The desert was already dangerous, and this hidden hole was a trap waiting to happen. No child, no ghost, just nature and old forgotten things playing tricks on the mind. I packed my gear, leaving the crevice behind. The crying stopped as soon as I moved away. The desert swallowed the sound and kept its secret. Walking away, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The desert was full of hidden places like that. Places where silence could sound like a voice and shadows could hide stories. But whatever was down there wasn't alive, and I wasn't about to find out what it really was. I kept walking toward my next water stop, the sun rising higher, burning away the chill and the strange feelings the night had left me with. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but at least now, I knew what to fear and what to leave alone.